seems a simple thing. Yes, this love is keeping me young.
Hi friends, welcome back to Let's Not Applaud This Anymore. This episode will discuss Andy Warhol and his famous depiction of the late Marilyn Monroe. Andy Warhol's Marilyn Diptych showcases Marilyn Monroe's fame and death within one work. On the left is Monroe's face featured in 1953's Niagara. Monroe is notably insincere looking, and the depth of her face diminishes to the screen printing method Warhol is famous for. Her entity is the juxtaposition against the bold and vibrant orange background. The prints are perfect and repeated. Her image is preserved to this colored screen, so to speak. The counterpart, the right-hand side, is an eerie symbol of death and decay. Marilyn's pristine image is ruined and tainted by splotchy applications on the print. Her face is dark. The entirety of the right side doesn't feature an ounce of colored ink. It's colorless, again, to endorse the disturbing theme of death. She had, after all, been addicted to sleeping pills due to the stress of Hollywood fame and fortune. The entirety of the Marilyn Diptych is at the intersection of religiousness and consumerism, playing into a more enormous, more introspective scope of one's perception of how we intake, idealize, and consume real-life icons. The praise for the three-dimensional piece is something to be fond after. How can a lie be so egregious yet so unseen? A mighty feat in itself. The Marilyn Diptych is not an honorable display of Monroe. It's humiliating and diminishes the life of the former star. It's borderline appalling. Warhol's effect on the artwork did not provide tribute at all, and instead constituted for the objectifying view of Monroe that still stands today.
And I'm trying hard to see how we fit inside love.
Monroe, throughout her life, fought against the typical depiction of herself, an object, and relentlessly fought against such allegations. Monroe is quoted directly in Life magazine, eerily close to her death nonetheless, stating, "That's the trouble, a sex symbol becomes a thing. I hate to be just a thing." She believed that open sexuality should not turn a person into a lesser and should not devalue her humanity outside of that. Her personhood, because she was a sexual woman, was, however, degraded heavily, which Andy Warhol, as a man who couldn't relate to the struggles of actually being a sexual woman, was inspired by. Andy Warhol, for context, was gay. He couldn't be open and sexual, so in his eyes, her struggle to be humanized was something he aspired to be. And recently, in 2004, an article titled Icon Curiosity, Andy Warhol in the Art of Secular Iconography, author Ruth Adams depicts this intersection as Monroe was an object struggling to be taken seriously as a subject. However, Warhol was a subject that aspired to be an object. Warhol wanted to be, for lack of better words, dehumanized in a similar way to Marilyn. He wanted to be openly sexual, to be seen, but being homosexual in the 1960s and 1970s was borderline a criminal offense. His livelihoods would have been entirely lost, something Monroe did not have to face aside from her scrutinies. Warhol was the textbook definition of jealousy for a fair reason. But, despite his tribulations with sexuality and viewing Monroe's sexuality as an escape, it does not diminish the fact that for her, there was no escape, something that cannot be ignored when discussing Warhol's glorification, in even better words, envy, of the star's sexuality. Warhol's fascination with Monroe, featured strongly in the Marilyn Diptych's flat and sleazy repetitions in the left-hand prints, was the idea that, eventually, he could leave if he wanted to. Monroe, dead by the time Warhol had even begun his Marilyn prints, is forcibly stuck to these irreparable objectifications.
And I know it ain't right how we fight, but it's true.
And even more so, most praise about the Marilyn Diptych stems from the idea that the objectification is a song of some more significant meaning to Hollywood's icon-to-death pipeline Monroe was tossed into. This is also criminally overstepping the original origins of the Diptych. Andy Warhol, again obsessed with Monroe and her sexuality, was just inspired to make prints of her. He was inspired by the media surrounding her death, which is typical of a pop artist. The idea of creating a diptych didn't come from Warhol himself, instead being suggested when the art collectors Burton and Emily Tremaine visited Warhol's home. They suggested that 2 canvases he had already made be presented as a diptych, to which Warhol responded, "Gee whiz, yes." Personally, the praise of Warhol for such a remarkable and somber meaning feels a little bit unwarranted because it wasn't his idea in the first place. He just wanted to replicate Monroe because he creepily idealized her objectification for his own personal reasons. Warhol had made something close to 23 Marilyn works before the end of the year that she died, a creepy and obsessive fact that is kind of just brushed under the rug. His true intended meaning, realized by the public or not, therefore, of the Marilyn works is just to objectify Marilyn Monroe. Of course, after her death, nonetheless. Warhol is quoted saying about the repetitions themselves that the more you look at the exact same thing, the more meaning goes away, and the better and emptier you feel. While a very interesting quote, the meaning of it is grave when looked at through a Marilyn Monroe lens. He intended viewers to see Monroe as meaningless, to attach nothing to the star except for her image. The intention, through his words, was never to provide Monroe sympathy from the scrutiny she experienced within Hollywood. He wanted to diminish her experiences entirely.
But it's true. Don't you know it's true? And you know it too.
Her experiences, her scrutiny, and her life are only withheld by these memorials of her, making their creational meanings the most essential idea of a portrait. As quoted in a journal studying the Marilyn Diptych published recently by Celebrity Studies, the portrait, the Marilyn Diptych, is conducive to communicating this tension between immortality and death, because it is an art form that historically has functioned to provide its subjects with a pictorial afterlife. And while this is true, the idea raised from this information is picturing the afterlife Warhol gives Marilyn Monroe. The afterlife presented from his renditions painfully diminishes her experiences as a person, instead using his fame to portray Marilyn naturally or just avoiding offering her presentation entirely. Warhol chooses to paint her flatly and in a purely objective manner, consistent with previous rhetoric about the star's human nature. Discussing the effects, smarthistory.org, a website publishing purely art history-related subjects, defines the effects as transforming the literal flatness of the paper-thin publicity photo into an emotional flatness, and the actress into some kind of automaton. The painting suggests that Marilyn Monroe, a manufactured star with a made-up name, is a merely one-dimensional sex symbol. The painting is a social commentary about the star itself, not Hollywood. Warhol refuses, through his work, to sympathize with her through his depictions. The repetitions are no longer reprimanding Hollywood about how they treated a former star. It's more reprimanding a woman who was tossed into the spotlight kind of unexpectedly about that. It's very misogynistic and not something to be applauded at all, because it's not right. Warhol does coexist, which has been observed in this podcast, with a truly unique perspective. He is a man, but is also oppressed, and sees Monroe, oppressed by Hollywood, as an idol. He is jealous, as observed, and curates this image of taking something away from her, and with perspectives, it's merely opinion-based. So, taking something away from another person, regardless of personal attachment, is a flawed idea, and it cannot be continued to be ignored when discussing Warhol and his flat depiction of Monroe, because just because he was very oppressed does not mean that he can have power to oppress another person in a weird form of retaliation.
I can be the man that you need. Oh, need.
And it's unfortunate. The Marilyn Diptych will not cease in relevance anytime soon when discussing Monroe. We, the audience, must continue to think critically about the Marilyn Diptych and any other depictions of Marilyn in general. We, the audience, give Warhol power over Monroe by glossing over essential facts that, truthfully, cannot afford to be ignored any longer. By not giving the power of his works by talking highly about the meanings behind him, or fake meanings, as we've revealed, they will subside into just another picture on the wall, where they should stay. Monroe's true story educates people about the negative consequences of Hollywood pressures, and Warhol, in truth, did nothing. We can set a precedent for how we remember our stars in the future, and that is what we should remember and what we should think about when we engage with this sort of art form, because pictures, while they are just pictures, are only important when they have meaning to them, and we should instill the meaning that is truthfully behind them. I hope you've learned something today. Let's just not applaud Andy Warhol anymore, because he's weird.